The bed's wide. You could stay here. Stay forever if you like. Clara froze at the threshold, her hand trembling against the wooden latch. But behind her, Elias's calloused grip caught her wrist, holding her back. The quiet man she had married by introduction, in a bargain without love, built on dry promises, now stood close enough that his breath warmed the nape of her neck. The simple timber room glowed with firelight, the dark blue quilt upon the bed, a silent invitation, heavy and tender all at once. Clara heard her heartbeat quicken, remembering the long nights on the wagon road, the dread of giving her life to a stranger. Yet this moment felt different. His hand did not force, only steadied. His words carried no sweetness, but pressed past the defenses around her heart. That night, would the line between an arranged union and a true beginning be swept away? Clara Whitmore clutched the letter, the paper trembling between her thin fingers. Each bold line pressed heavier than the old wooden trunk she had dragged from St. Louis, stuffed with patched clothing and memories gone brittle. 6 months ago, her father had died, leaving not a legacy but a mountain of debts from long nights at the gambling table. The house, the furniture, the clock, even the familiar chair by the kitchen hearth, everything had been sold. In her possession remained only one thing, her mother's worn wedding ring, strung on a thin cord around her neck. Each time she bent forward, the cold metal touched her skin, reminding her that once there had been a family, though now it lived only in memory. The past could not feed her, and the future, unless she seized a chance, promised nothing but a dark pit. That chance was written in the letter. Marjorie, her cousin in Montana, had written that a man named Elias Turner, 32, owned land and a new log house but lacked a home. He offered no promise of love, no romance. He offered only respect and fidelity. If things failed, he would pay for her passage back east. Clara read that line again and again, stark and plain, yet in her circumstances, more than anything she had ever been given. A textile mill? Wages too meager. Tutoring? No one wanted a girl without connections. The widowers and old men who lingered? Their eyes made her skin crawl. No, she had no choice but to step into marriage with a stranger. On the day she left St. Louis, the June sky hung heavy, hot, and choking with dust. Clara climbed onto the coach, clutching her small bag. A handful of passengers sat silent, indifferent to her, a frail Eastern girl with hollow eyes. The driver snapped his whip. Hooves struck the cobbled road. Wheels groaned against stone. Clara drew in a breath, feeling as though her life had rolled out of all that was familiar and into a nameless country. The stage ran day and night. By day, the sun beat like a furnace, wind flinging red dust that coated her dress and hair. By night, they slept rough at relay stations, on hard benches, listening to the wind moan through the walls. Clara lay awake, staring at the dark rafters, a single name filling her thoughts. Elias Turner. What sort of man would he be? A harsh brute seeking only a servant? Or a quiet soul who kept his word? Her fingers brushed the silver cord at her chest, the ring cold against her skin. On one side stood the memory of her parents' love, though it ended in debt and ruin. On the other side, a marriage bargained like a trade, born of agreement. The two images overlapped, leaving Clara trembling, yet resolute. One evening, the stage rolled through a small town. Children's laughter rang. Women stood before the dress shop. Men lounged in noisy saloons. Clara looked out through the wooden window, her chest tightening. Each one of them belonged somewhere. She sat with only a letter and a stranger's name to hold to by the third day. The road grew rougher. Stones, ruts, choking dust. A young fellow behind her coughed hard. A peddler smirked and muttered, "Another Eastern girl hunting a husband." Clara heard clear, but gave no answer. It was truth enough. Denial meant nothing. On the final night, the coach halted at a station. Moonlight slid across the barren plain, pale and cold. Clara could not sleep. The image of Elias shifted, sometimes a hard face, eyes like stone, sometimes a steady man, silent but decent. Either way, tomorrow he would be her husband. The thought left her hollow and afraid. At dawn, the horses slowed. The wheels rattled into a weathered station with a sagging roof. A cracked sign read, "Eagle Ridge Station." The driver called out, "End of the line!" Clara sat frozen. Her legs numbed from the long road, but her heart carried the greater weight. She drew a deep breath and stepped down. Her shoes struck dirt, and the sharp scent of wild grass filled her nose. The air here was strange, dry, thin, as if it drained her breath. The sky stretched vast and dizzying, the far-off mountains painted blue against the edge of sight. She stood still, clutching her bag, her fingers pressing the hidden ring through the cloth. In her mind, the pounding of hooves and the words from the letter merged. No romance, only respect and fidelity. Clara knew there was no turning back. Before her lay a beginning hazy and uncertain, a marriage struck as a bargain for survival. Yet within that emptiness might rest the one thing she had never known, a true home. The stagecoach slowed before a weathered wooden station. The faded sign, Eagle Ridge, swayed in the wind. Clara stepped down onto the dry earth, her legs shaking not only from the long, jolting ride, but from a nameless dread pressing on her chest. A woman's voice rang out. "Clara!" A middle-aged woman rushed forward, wrapping her arms tight around her. A white bonnet shaded half her face, but the voice and the eyes were unmistakable. Marjorie, her cousin, unseen since childhood. Clara leaned into that embrace, her throat tightening, feeling for the first time in months the comfort of family. "Good Lord, look at you, skin and bone. The road must have been misery. No need to tell me, I can see it." Marjorie spoke while pulling Clara along the dirt path that led into town. The air was dry, heavy with dust and wild grass, yet Clara heard warmth in her cousin's voice. Marjorie's home stood at the edge of town, a plain wooden house with a narrow porch and a thin line of smoke curling from the chimney. Out in the yard, a broad-shouldered man with sleeves rolled stood before a glowing forge. Each strike of his hammer rang sharp against iron, sparks flying in the afternoon light, casting fire across his sunburned face. "That's Thomas, my husband. He doesn't speak much, but he's a good man," Marjorie said, her hand still resting on Clara's shoulder. Clara watched the scene, a strange feeling rising in her chest. The fire, the hammer's rhythm, the man bent to his work, foreign and rough, yet safe somehow, as if reminding her this land was carved out by hand and sweat. Inside the house, the scent of fresh bread mingled with wood smoke. The furnishings were plain, a few wooden chairs, a long table, ironwork tools hung on the wall. Clara set down her small bag, her hand trembling as if she had just laid her whole fate upon the floor. Marjorie poured her a cup of warm water and sat across from her. In the lamplight, her face bore lines of weariness, but her eyes glowed steady and sure. Elias Turner. You'll want to know more about him. Clara's heart clenched at the name that had haunted her across the miles. She nodded, her fingers tightening on the cup. He's a quiet man. Works hard. Came here with nothing 6 years ago, and now he owns a good spread, a strong cabin, a decent herd, all built by his own hand. Marjorie paused, choosing words with care. There was once a girl he meant to marry. She died of fever, right before the wedding day. Since then, Elias has lived close-mouthed, pouring himself into cattle, fences, timber. But Clara, remember this, he's never broken his word. Out here, a promise weighs more than gold. Clara sat silent. Fear pressed in on her, yet so did gratitude. A man who had borne loss, who lived withdrawn, yet kept his word. That was the only anchor she could hold in a marriage without love. Marjorie studied her face, then took Clara's hand. You're afraid, aren't you? Anyone would be given to a man you've never seen. But Elias is not cruel. He wants a home. And you need a place to begin again. Perhaps 2 empty places can fill one another. Clara drew a long breath, her eyes stinging. Since her father's death, no one had taken her hand and spoken to her so plainly. Outside, Thomas's hammer still beat its rhythm, iron against iron, steady as the heartbeat of this land. Through the small window, Clara watched the sparks flare against his solid frame, and suddenly she thought, perhaps here, among smoke and dust, among folk who spoke little but kept their word, she might find a true chance. Marjorie set her hand lightly on the letter Clara had laid upon the table. He'll come tomorrow. Rest while you can. The first meeting will be hard, but I believe it will turn out right. Clara nodded, her throat tight. The fear still lingered, but now it mingled with a fragile glimmer, the glimmer of a new beginning. Morning in Eagle Ridge began with the crow of a rooster and the drift of kitchen smoke rising from Marjorie's small cabin. Clara woke after a restless night, smoothed her hair, straightened her plain dress, her stomach tight with dread. Today she would meet the man who might bind himself to her for life. When a rider appeared at the end of the dusty road, Clara held her breath. The man came at a measured pace, tall, sun-browned, every movement spare and steady. Noon light struck his arms, tracing strong lines of muscle. When he halted before the porch, his eyes, clear, unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, stilled her heart. Marjorie stepped forward to greet him. This is Elias Turner, and this, Clara Whitmore. He nodded, removed his hat. His face was darkened by sun, his jaw cut firm, his gaze direct, calm yet not cold. Clara dipped her head. No polite chatter, no forced smiles, only silence, and words as plain as marks cut into wood. Elias spoke first, voice low, certain. I've land, a house and need of a wife, but I've no romance. Clara's pulse thundered, but she answered evenly. I'm not seeking romance. I'm seeking a way to live. The room fell still. Only the clang of Thomas's hammer rang from the yard, striking iron like a metronome. Elias drew a small leather pouch from his coat, set it on the table. The coins inside clinked sharp. If it doesn't suit, this will send you home. Clara looked at the money, an open escape, yet the bluntness steadied her more than empty promises ever could. She lifted her gaze, met his eyes, and gave her answer in silence. Marjorie read it and quietly withdrew, leaving two strangers alone across the table. No long words, no circles around the truth. A choice was made in a few breaths. The next morning, Eagle Ridge carried a different hue. The sky shone clear, sunlight soft, wind heavy with the scent of wild grass. The chapel by the creek stood weathered, a wooden roof faded, a cross bright against the sky. Clara wore a simple blue dress, a borrowed white shawl from Marjorie. Elias arrived in dark trousers and a freshly laundered shirt. His hair combed, beard trimmed. The gathering was small. Marjorie and Thomas, a few curious townsfolk, and the old minister with kind eyes. The ceremony was plain. No flowers, no music, only the steady reading of vows. Clara stood beside Elias, her hands locked before her, heart hammering. "Do you take this man to share life in hardship as in peace?" the minister asked. Clara's voice wavered, but rang clear. "I do." "Do you take this woman to walk beside you in joy and in sorrow?" Elias answered, firm as stone. "I do." The minister's amen broke the silence, and the small crowd nodded. It was swift, almost severe. Yet when the minister spoke, "You may kiss the bride," Elias bent and pressed his mouth to Clara's. It was not a sweet kiss from girlish dreams, just a brief touch, dry, fleeting. But Clara trembled through her bones, not from passion alone, but from the stark knowledge that her life had turned a corner with no way back. When Elias drew away, his eyes remained steady, but within them Clara caught a flicker. Whether pity, respect, or simple acceptance she could not say. Yet the flicker softened her heart. They signed the marriage book, clean and final. Marjorie embraced Clara, whispering, "From now on, you have a home." The meal that followed was no feast, just a quick supper at the town eatery. A wooden table, plates of cold meat, bread, and bitter coffee. Clara ate in silence, stealing glances at Elias across from her. He chewed slow, his face unreadable, but never dismissive. When curious eyes strayed their way, he met them with a small nod. Clara understood. He was not a man who boasted, but neither did he hide. When the meal was done, Elias stood and pulled out her chair. The gesture, plain as it was, startled her. His voice, rough but clear, followed. "From this day, you are my wife." No sugar in the words, but weight enough to carve into stone. Clara bowed her head, her chest tightening. That afternoon, as they left the eatery, late sun poured down the yellow dust of the street. Townsfolk watched in silence, whispers trailing behind. Clara walked beside Elias, feeling as though the whole town bore witness to her first steps into a new life. On the chapel porch, the old minister raised his hand in farewell, eyes warm with blessing. Marjorie and Thomas stood behind, their faces a mix of worry and hope. Clara drew a deep breath, fixing every detail in memory. This was the moment of beginning, the moment a woman with nothing left had staked her future on the hand of a stranger. The first kiss had been dry, fleeting, yet its taste lingered. It reminded Clara that this union was not born of love, but perhaps, in this harsh land, something else might yet take root. After the brief ceremony in the wooden chapel, Elias Turner steadied Clara down the steps, then, without hesitation, lifted her onto the horse. The motion was firm, sure, without a trace of awkwardness. Clara gasped, breath caught, with no time to protest. In an instant, she sat in front, Elias climbing up behind her. The bay horse snorted and moved forward at a slow, steady pace, leaving the town behind. Clara sat upright, fingers tight on the saddle, her heart hammering. Yet the presence of Elias close behind pressed on her senses. His body leaned near, not heavy, but enough that she felt each even breath, the leather of his coat, the sweat-earned scent of labor. It was a closeness Clara had never prepared for. No man had ever been near enough for her to hear the beat of his heart. It frightened her, yet carried a strange calm. Fear, because such closeness left no room for doubt. Calm, because Elias did not press nor claim. He simply rode steady, reins in hand, letting her lean as she needed. The road stretched long, dust rising beneath hooves. The prairie opened wide ahead, rolling hills scattered with trees, the far mountains dark blue and towering. Clara had never seen such vastness, wild and solemn. Wind tangled her hair, lifting pale strands across her cheek, forcing her eyes to blink against the sting. Elias bent close, his voice low by her ear. "Hold on. The road's long yet." Clara nodded, tightening her grip on the saddle, leaning back slightly against him for balance. She caught the rhythm of his breathing, steady as the earth itself. The jolting ride of the stagecoach days before had worn her thin, but here, each jolt felt like a shared heartbeat, pulling her from the hollow ache. For 2 hours, they rode near wordless. Hoofbeats drummed, wind hissed past, a lone bird called across the emptiness. Clara let her mind drift with the land. At times, she closed her eyes, her back resting closer, as if the emptiness within her was being filled by another's quiet strength. Once the horse stumbled on rough ground. Clara pitched sideways, nearly losing her seat. At once, Elias's arm closed firm around her waist. His voice was short, unyielding. "Don't fear. I've got you." Spare words, but they rang through her chest like a vow. She drew breath, realizing her heart no longer pounded from terror, but from something new, unnamed. At times, Elias shifted the reins, strong hands brushing her arm by chance, heat sparking through the work-rough skin. She dared not turn, only bit her lip and sat still, holding back what threatened to spill over. By late day, the sun sank low, casting gold across the plain. Clara found she had stopped counting time. Wind, light, earth, and the steady form behind her had melted into something whole, something that no longer felt lonely. She thought back to the morning's kiss, brief, dry, cold. Yet this ride, without touch, without words, had drawn her nearer than any kiss could, closeness carved, from silence, from a presence that could not be denied. Clara sighed softly, closing her eyes a moment. Marjorie's letter had said Elias Turner promised no romance, only respect and fidelity. But pressed against him now, she wondered if such promises might take shape in another form, quiet, steadfast, enduring. The wind rose as they climbed a gentle slope. Elias pulled the reins. The horse slowed. He spoke again, only the second time since they had left town. "We're near now." Just 3 words. Yet Clara's chest lifted with sudden, sharp anticipation. She opened her eyes. Ahead, silhouetted against a burning horizon, stood the outline of a cabin. The 2-story cabin came into view as the light of evening turned copper. It stood firm on a gentle hill, a narrow creek curling behind it, the dark line of mountains rising far beyond. The porch stretched wide, a pale curtain shifting in the prairie wind. Cattle grazed lazily in the yard, unconcerned with the new arrivals. Clara sat rigid in the saddle, eyes wide. This was no grand estate, yet every beam and shutter spoke of patient hands and hard labor, one man's strength carved into timber. Elias reined the horse, stepped down, then reached for Clara. His motion was steady, brief, but in that instant her feet touched the ground as though weightless. She lifted her gaze. Straight roof, stout porch posts, windows thrown open to light. Something stirred in her chest, both strange and strangely welcoming. "This is our home," Elias said, voice low and even. Clara nodded, words still lodged in her throat. From the barn, a young red-haired boy came running, hay clinging to his sleeves. "Pete," Elias called, "this is Mrs. Turner." The boy whipped off his cap, bowing quickly. "An honor, ma'am." Clara faltered, managed a nod. The title Mrs. Turner struck her ears with a weight that settled hard upon her heart. Elias guided her toward the porch, his hand light at her back. Not urging, but steadying. The door opened to a bright room warmed by a wide hearth. A long table anchored the space, sturdy chairs around it. On the shelves, pots and jars sat in neat rows. The mingled scent of pine and wood smoke wrapped the air, far from the cold lodging house of the night before. Clara's eyes moved slowly over each detail. The log walls sealed with clay and straw, rough-hewn furniture built to endure, cotton curtains of pale blue framing the windows. A woman's hand had touched here. Elias read her thought and said simply, "Marjorie helped with those. I wouldn't have chosen well." The plain admission eased something in her. He knew where he lacked and did not hide it. Up the stairs, each board creaked but held. The hall opened to 3 doors. Elias stopped at the largest, pushed it open. The room glowed soft in the fading light. A broad bed stood ready, covered in a dark blue quilt. A wooden chair with a stitched cushion sat by the window. A pine chest faced the wall, and above it hung a small painting of far-off peaks. "This will be yours," Elias said from the doorway. "I'll take another room, until you're ready." Clara turned. His sun-browned face was calm, his eyes clear and unwavering. The words carried no politeness for show, but the weight of a vow. It was distance but not coldness, a quiet shield of respect. Her fingers tightened on her dress. A part of her nearly wept, not from disappointment, but from relief. In a life where choice had been stripped from her, he offered her this, the right to decide. It was mercy, plain and firm. She whispered, "Thank you." He gave a single nod, then stepped back. "There's water in the basin. Call if you need." His figure vanished down the hall. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hand brushing the quilt. This bed, this room, hers now. The thought caught her breath. Outside, dusk spilled gold across the prairie. The ball of cattle drifted faint from the pasture. The wind scraped along the eaves. Clara closed her eyes, listening. The hammering from a forge far off, the shuffle of hooves in the barn. These were not the noises of the city, but the heartbeat of a new life pressing close. This room was more than a place to sleep. It was the line between the ruin she had fled and the unknown ahead. Elias had set distance, and that distance steadied her more than any hollow promise could. That night, Clara lay beneath the new quilt, staring at the timbered ceiling. Each gust, each creak of wood, echoed in the solitude. Yet she did not feel the despair of nights past. In the room beside her, Elias Turner lay as well, a man of few words, yet one who had left her space to breathe. Clara pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her mother's ring beneath the cloth. For the first time it spoke not only of loss, but of a cord pulling her toward what might be. In the quiet she whispered, "Mother, I will try. Here, I will learn to belong." The prairie wind slipped through the cracks, carrying the scent of hay. Clara closed her eyes, letting the night's steady breath rock her into her first sleep beneath the roof of her new home. Autumn crept slow across the prairie, but in a single afternoon the sky turned. Thick clouds rolled in, black as pitch, swallowing what light remained. Clara was folding calico on the table when the first rumble shook the glass panes like a drumbeat of war. Dust whipped into spirals across the porch, the windows rattling in their frames. Wind shrieked through the gaps in the walls, carrying the dry sting of hay. Clara moved to the window, heart pounding as lightning tore across the heavens, brilliant and gone, leaving only a suffocating dark. Then a crack split the air, shaking the cabin to its bones. Clara cried out. In the yard, the cattle bawled in terror, surging against the fences until the rails splintered, beasts scattering wild into the rain and thunder. "Elias!" Her breath caught on the name. He flashed past the doorway, rain lashing his face, clothes plastered tight to his frame. Without a glance back, Elias charged into the pasture, whip in hand, his shout cutting against the gale. Hooves thundered, voices clashed with the roar of the storm, the chaos enough to choke Clara's breath. She clung to the doorframe, trembling, eyes fixed on his figure. Against the sheets of rain he loomed broad and unyielding, yet small beneath the weight of heaven's fury. His coat clung to his back, hair plastered dark across his brow. Clara bit her lip hard. For the first time she saw how fragile all of it was. This roof above her, this man, this threadbare hope for a future. One stroke of lightning, and it could be swept away. The wind howled like a beast, the fire in the hearth sucked wild with the draft, flames whipping high. Clara dropped to her knees, whispering prayers between gasps. Each crash of thunder struck her chest like a hammer. Again and again she pleaded, "Lord, bring him back. Let him live." Through the window she glimpsed him still, riding hard after the scattered herd. His whip cracked, his voice carried through the storm. Beside him, young Pete fought to keep pace, pale as chalk but refusing to fall back. The sight of the boy alongside him made Clara's throat burn with a cry she could not release. Her legs would not move from the floor. Lightning struck near the barn, earth erupting in sparks of stone and dirt. Clara screamed, clutching her chest. Through that blinding flash she saw him, Elias, still upright in the saddle, cutting through the storm. Her heart plunged, then surged again with its beat. Time dragged merciless, each minute an hour. Clara moved restlessly about the cabin, feeding the fire, setting coffee to boil, laying out dry cloths, anything to keep from breaking under the weight. Outside, rain lashed like whips, cattle bellowed, fences crashed under the weight of the storm. Night came fast, though the sky never darkened fully. Lightning fired so constant, it seemed day still lingered. And in each burst of fire, Clara caught sight of Elias riding, driving the herd, unbroken. He had been her husband less than a day, yet already he was the pillar on which her very life depended. At last Elias came back, swaying in the doorway. His coat was torn at the shoulder, blood seeping through the cloth. He limped, leaving a trail of water across the floorboards. Clara's heart seized. All the fear bottled since the storm's first thunder now rushed her throat. She did not pause. She rushed to him, guided him inside. Firelight cast their shadows high on the wall, wavering but locked together. Elias sank heavy into a chair, breath ragged. She tugged the wet coat from his shoulder, clumsy but determined. His sun-darkened skin showed a deep red gash running the length of his arm. Clara dared not linger on it. She worked fast, dipping a cloth in warm water, washing away mud and blood. Droplets slid down the carved lines of muscle, his breath rising hot and rough against her chest, making her tremble. He sat still, eyes half shut, yielding to her care. For the first time, the distance between them broke beneath the simple act of tending. When the wound was bound, she laid a quilt across him, yet she did not leave. She sat by his bed, eyes fixed on his weathered face as it eased. That night she stayed near, listening to each heavy breath, afraid that if she looked away, he might vanish back into the storm. The days after, the wound kept Elias to rest. Each morning Clara brought warm water, washing his face, wiping him down, helping him into clean clothes. At first her hands shook, shy at touching the body of a stranger, but Elias never flinched. He let her work, sometimes nodding, his bright eyes steady beneath long lashes, full of trust. That trust unsettled her. Each brush of her hand over shoulder or arm sent heat to her face. She bowed her head to hide the blush, while inside something tender stirred, half shame, half sweetness. In the afternoons, with sunlight slanting through the window, she opened the shutters for fresh wind. Elias lay back, the golden light warming his face. She dressed his wound with careful fingers, only to falter when his eyes met hers, steady and searching, leaving her breath caught. Once, as she bent close to tie the bandage, her brow brushed his shoulder. Elias drew in a breath but did not move. She pulled back, flustered, yet found no reproach in his gaze, only the calm of deep water. That calm gave her courage to go on. At night she kept to the chair by his bed. When pain made him stir, she steadied the bandage, pulled the quilt close. Once he woke in the dark, voice hoarse. "You've not slept?" She shook her head. "I must be sure you've no fever." He watched her a long moment, then closed his eyes again, his breathing slowing. It was not thanks spoken, but Clara understood. Silence can weigh heavier than words. Day by day, the room became theirs. No more rigid distance like that first night. She grew used to washing him each morning, to her hands grazing warm skin, to his breath near. Each act of care lit a quiet flame inside her. Elias, though spare with words, began to shift as well. When she passed him a bowl of water, his fingers brushed hers. Whether by chance or not, it made her pulse jump. When she leaned close to bind his arm, he followed her with long, unspoken looks, as if holding back what he wished to say. One evening, after days of rain, the sky cleared and sunset poured red through the window. Clara folded the cloth in her lap when Elias spoke. "I never thought anyone would sit here, tend to me so." Her hand froze. He turned, his eyes alight in the glow. "I'm grateful." Her throat tightened. She answered softly, "I only do what must be done." He fell silent, but the faint smile at his mouth was enough to shake her heart. That night she did not keep to the chair. When Elias said quietly, "The bed's wide. You may lie here," I'll not touch you. Rest is all you need. She hesitated, then eased onto the mattress, a space still between them. In the dark, their breaths rose and fell together. Clara felt her own heartbeat race, then steady, matching his. In that moment she knew what bound strangers was not promises, but trust. And trust was where they had begun to find one another. A week after the storm, Elias's wound had begun to knit. He could walk the yard again, mend broken rails, tend the horses with one arm, though Clara still stopped him whenever sweat gathered on his brow. That evening the air lay calm, the wind carrying scents of hay and wood smoke across the porch. Clara cleared the table, washed the dishes, then paused, taking in the warmth of the room. Fire burned steady in the hearth, its glow tracing Elias's face where he sat back in his chair, eyes half closed, broad shoulders rising and falling with quiet strength, as if he were part of the house itself. When he rose and moved slow up the stairs, Clara followed, heart pounding. They had grown used to sharing a room while he healed, but tonight he needed no tending hand. The door opened. Elias stepped inside, and Clara followed as though it were natural. He sat on the edge of the bed, pulled off his dust-stained boots, then looked up. That look stopped Clara still. She whispered, voice trembling, "If you're well now, from tonight I'll return to my room." The air froze. She turned toward the door, hand on the latch, when his large hand closed around her wrist. Warm, sure, not forcing, but steady. His voice, low and rough with feeling, came clear. "The bed's wide. You can stay here. Stay forever, if you like." Clara stood silent. The plain words blew through every wall she had left. Not a command, not a plea, but an opening. An admission that from this moment they belonged. She turned, eyes wet, met the quiet blue of his, and then, as if a cord stretched too long had finally snapped, she stepped near, her hand resting on his shoulder. Elias drew her into his arms, holding her tight within his chest. In the dim room, firelight from the hearth danced against their faces. Breath mingled, fast, then slow, two rivers folding into one. Clara felt her heart race, then settle to the beat of Elias's steady pulse. He kissed her then, no longer with the reserve of a wedding vow, nor the fleeting spark of the storm. This kiss was deeper, lingering, a vow without words. Clara trembled, but did not retreat. She answered with all the trust they had built in silence. The room filled with warm quiet. Wind moved outside, wood cracked in the hearth, each sound a hymn to their joining. Awkward touches, tender and earnest, wove the beginning of true love. Later, Clara lay in Elias's arms, her head against his chest, ear to the steady drum of his heart. The smells of leather, smoke, and sweat no longer felt strange, but like the scent of home itself. Elias held her close, his hand brushing slow along her back, as if carving her presence into his very life. Eyes closed, Clara let herself drift with the rhythm of his breath. She knew then love was not born of sweet words, but of trust, of sharing, of standing side by side through storm. That night, all distance vanished. Beyond the walls, the prairie stretched in restless dark, wind roaming wild, but in the small cabin, two souls, once strangers, had found each other. Clara smiled faintly, lips moving with words she did not voice. "I've found my home." Days slipped into a new rhythm. far different from the silence of those first weeks. At dawn, Elias walked the fields, while Clara tended the kitchen and house. By dusk, he returned, clothes dark with sweat and dust, and she was waiting with a plain but warm meal. It was all ordinary work, yet in every small act, something quiet spread between them, as steady as wildflowers blooming unbidden along a path. One evening, Elias came back from town with a brown paper bundle. He set it on the table, his voice uncertain. "Thought you might need this." Inside lay calico with a neat floral print and a few hardbound novels. Clara froze, then smiled before she could stop herself. The gifts were simple, yet spoke of his notice. He had seen her finish the stack of old books, had thought of curtains or cloths for the kitchen. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice unsteady. Elias only nodded, but a faint light stirred in his eyes. She arranged wildflowers in a jar for the table, folded fresh cloth from the calico, the scent of baking bread filling the room. Elias paused at the doorway, gaze lingering on the scene. He said nothing, but the faint curve at his mouth made Clara's heart shake. At night they sat by the fire, Elias with a book, Clara with her knitting. Now and then their eyes met, a smile or a nod bridging the silence. Once Elias asked, "Would you want more ground for a garden? The back lot's open." Clara looked at him, surprised at the question. "I'd like that. It would mean more food for winter." The short talk warmed her more than all the fine speeches she had once heard in the city. It was his way of letting her step into his world, as a partner, not just a keeper of his house. On another day, while splitting wood, he caught sight of her tying back her hair, forehead damp with sweat from hanging laundry. A rare smile broke across his face. Brief, but Clara saw it, and her chest tightened. She noticed, too, how he had grown used to her presence. When she set fresh bread on the table, he nodded, his voice low. "Good." One word, but to Clara, worth more than a page of praise. One rainy night, they sat closer by the fire. Clara read from a new novel, lips curved at a passage. Elias leaned back, eyes closed, listening to the rain. When her soft laugh slipped out, he opened his eyes, met hers, and shared the moment without a word. That look was enough to tell her she was seen, that she belonged. These small gestures, unnoticed by any but them, became proof of something growing. A hand brushing another as they lifted a basket, an eye lingering longer than it should. A nod when she said the storeroom was in order. Clara began to believe love did not strike like thunder, but crept in through such moments, steady as seed hidden in soil until the green broke through. Elias remained quiet, yet sometimes let slip fragments of his heart. One evening he spoke of his first winter here, alone in an empty house, snow cutting off every tone, path. Only the scream of wind through the door. He had thought he would not endure. Clara said nothing, only set her hand on the table close to his. He did not pull away. That small choice felt like a wall crumbling. Each morning Clara watched him stride into the dawn, a tall figure against the light. Each evening, when he returned, the first eyes he sought were hers at the porch. No words were needed. They both knew the other's presence had become indispensable. Their feeling was never declared, but lived in detail. A jar of wildflowers, a strip of calico, the smell of bread from the oven, a novel left open by his chair, a fleeting smile after a day's labor. One night, Clara sat by the window, moonlight spilling across her lap. She thought, love does not come like lightning, but like a small fire, burning steady, warming the days. And she knew she was learning how to keep that fire alive with Elias through the simplest of gestures. That afternoon, prairie wind carried red dust, clinging to Clara's hair and dress. She stood on the porch, hand shading her eyes, gaze fixed down the trail. From far off came Elias, astride his horse, worn but steady after days away. His coat was stained with dust, his sun-darkened face roughened by weather. At the sight of him, Clara's heart pulled tight, as though a cord had snapped inside her, drawing her down the steps at a run. She forgot all form. Before Elias had fully dismounted, Clara threw her arms around him, breath quick and sharp. For a moment he stilled, then his arms closed firm around her, pulling her against his chest. No words passed, only a kiss, deep and fierce, born of days apart. It was no longer the restrained kiss of a wedding, nor the fleeting touch in the storm, but a sure claim. Clara trembled but did not let go. All distance dissolved in that instant. When Elias drew back, his eyes burned with a fire she had never seen. "I waited," Clara whispered. "So did I," Elias answered, voice rough, like wind through pine. From that night, evenings carried a different hue. No more silence drawn out, but closeness unhidden. In the wooden room they found each other like the parched find water, like fire finds dry kindling. Long days of solitude gave way to a bond that would not loosen. Elias, a man of few words, let his feeling show in touch. His hand trailed through Clara's hair, gentle yet burning. Each kiss pressed deeper, longer, carved like a mark that could not fade. Clara answered with trust built from each day spent building a home. As autumn nights grew longer, they lay close, sharing warmth. Clara listened to Elias's heartbeat, steady as hoofbeats on packed earth. In his arms, she felt safer than in any house she had known. Each brush of his hand, each glance became another piece of something whole. Day by day, she saw Elias soften. He returned from the pasture with wildflowers, setting them quietly in a jar. At supper, he shared small tales about the herd, about a calf's mischievous bite. To any other ear, they were plain, but to Clara, they were proof she had stepped into his world. Winter came with snow blanketing the porch. Wind tore at the eaves, but inside, fire glowed against Elias's face. Clara curled beneath a quilt, her head on his shoulder, listening to snow patter against the glass. His presence alone was enough to drive the cold away. One night, while the wind screamed, Elias held her tighter, his strong hand closing over hers. Long he sat silent, as if wrestling himself. Then in the dark his voice came low but clear. "I love you." Clara lifted her head, eyes wide. This man who had sworn never to love again now spoke those three words, plain, sacred. In the flicker of firelight, she saw truth in his blue eyes. Tears brimmed as she whispered back, voice unsteady, "I love you too." No storm nor trial marked that moment, only words simple and true. Two once strangers joined by circumstance had found each other in earnest. Love had come quiet, yet firm, like the earth itself. Outside, snow fell white and endless, but within the cabin, love burned bright enough to warm the length of winter. In the coldest days, they sat by the window, watching cattle gathered in the hollow. Elias showed her how to count them by eye, how to read the sky for snowfall. Clara listened closely, not for knowledge but for the gift of him opening his guarded world. One morning, after heavy snow, Elias led her from the barn. The ground stretched silver under the sun. He took her hand, his glove still warm against her fingers. They stood long in silence, letting the stillness itself bear witness. Clara knew their love would never parade in grand feasts or loud vows. It was quiet, like falling snow, but in time it would cover the prairie wide. Deep inside she understood. The fire now kindled in their hearts would not go out. Spring swept the prairie, carrying the smell of damp earth and the sheen of new green across the fields. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the cabin window, Clara pressed her hand to her belly and smiled. She knew life would never be the same. She told Elias that afternoon, when he returned from the stables, smelling of hay and leather. The sun-darkened man froze as she whispered, I'm with child." For a breath he stood still, unbelieving. Then his blue eyes lit with a mix of shock and joy. He scratched the back of his neck, exhaled a long breath, then stepped forward and folded Clara into his arms. His grip was firm, as if he meant to hold the world itself in his embrace. "Truly?" he asked, voice low and rough. "Truly," Clara answered, her eyes shining. From then on, Elias became awkward but tender. He insisted on carrying the wash basket, fumbling with the clothes while Clara laughed at his clumsy handling. He added a chair to the kitchen and ordered her to sit whenever she stood too long. Hands once trained to hammer, and reins now swept floors and carried buckets, often poorly, but with care that pierced Clara's heart. At night, when she slept, Elias sat at the table under lamplight, shaping a small locket from gold he had kept aside. It was not only jewelry, it was a promise. When at last it was done, he placed it in her hand, empty frame waiting for a picture. "So our child will know they were wanted from the beginning," he said, voice calm, eyes burning bright. Clara wept into his shoulder, smiling through tears. As months passed, her steps slowed, but her gaze grew brighter. The house filled with sounds of preparation. Elias sawing boards for a cradle, Clara sewing tiny blankets. Each ordinary act held the weight of waiting. When summer faded into crisp autumn, Clara's time came. Snow fell outside. Wind screamed around the eaves. Elias, near panic but steady, fetched the midwife from town. That night, the lamplight never dimmed. Clara labored, cries muffled in her throat. Elias gripping her hand, rough palm lending strength, eyes never leaving hers. Then, over the roar of the storm, came a child's first cry. Clara sobbed. Elias sat stunned, shoulders shaking. The midwife laid a red, strong infant in Clara's arms. "A son," she said. Clara cradled him, trembling. The child's blue eyes opened, bright as the prairie sky. Elias touched the soft, damp hair, voice hoarse. "He has your face, but my eyes." Clara smiled through tears. Pain melted, replaced by joy that filled every vein. Elias kissed her brow, then kissed his son's. In that moment, their family was born. The cabin soon rang with new sounds. The baby's cries mingled with wind, hammer blows, fire popping in the hearth. Each morning, Elias lifted the child so Clara could rest. He learned to soothe, to rock, even to change cloths with rough, uncertain hands. A man who once thought himself unfit for tenderness now hummed lullabies in a gravel talsin. voice that made Clara's heart ache with love. Often she watched him pace the room, babe in arms, and felt tears rise. One dawn she woke to find Elias dozing in a chair, eyes red, child sleeping peacefully against his chest. Her heart clenched, not from exhaustion, but from knowing she would never face life alone again. The house itself changed. The cradle stood in the main room, milk bottle by Elias's cup of coffee. Calico cloths turned to infant quilts and tiny shirts. Crying, laughter, lullabies, woven into the sound of hammer and fire. Even the town saw Elias anew. The hard man of few words now carried a child in his arms. Neighbors nodded. Marjorie wept softly, whispering to Clara, "I've never seen Elias so. You've changed him." Clara only smiled, knowing it was not her alone, but the child as well, who lit what had long been dark. By the next spring, the garden flourished, and Elias built an addition to the barn. He carried his son on his back while he worked, letting the boy hear the wind and cattle, breathe the scents of grass and earth. Clara watched from the porch, seeing strength and new life side by side. That evening, Elias set the locket in Clara's hand once more. Inside, tied with blue thread, lay a lock of their son's hair. "This is our family," he said. Clara's tears fell again, tears of joy. She knew now the cabin was no longer just shelter against storm and winter. It was home, a place where two hearts had joined, and now three, bound together by love that would endure through every season. 3 years had passed since the day Clara set foot in wind-swept Montana. Time had turned a lone timber cabin on the prairie into a home filled with laughter. The front yard no longer held only hoofbeats and the ring of a hammer, but the shouts of children at play. 3 little ones, bright-eyed and smiling, ran the porch, leaving tiny prints in the dust. The firstborn, Thomas, nearly 3, already gripped a small set of reins Elias had made for him. He toddled after his father to the stable, short legs pumping, eyes alight. The second, Margaret, named for cousin Marjorie, just past a year, with brown curls like Clara's, chirped at her mother's heels. The youngest, William, only a few months old, lay in the hand-built cradle, blue eyes tracking every motion in the room. The 2-story cabin, stout already, had been expanded. Elias raised a grain shed and another stall for the growing herd. Along the house, Clara planted a run of flowers beneath the porch. In spring and summer, wild blooms flared, yellow, purple, white, softening the rough timber with their gentle color. Each morning, when Clara opened the door, those colors and scents seemed to welcome the family into a new day. Clara often thought back to the beginning. She remembered her hands shaking around Marjorie's letter, the jolting coach, her first look at Elias, tall, quiet, hard to read. Then, she had sought only a way to survive. 3 years had shown she'd found far more: a family, a love, a new life. Elias, the quiet man, was still himself, yet changed. He spoke little, but his every act showed he had grown used to warmth around him. He no longer ate fast in silence. He listened while Thomas told riding tales with a stick horse. He carried Margaret on one arm while fixing a fence with the other. He sat for long stretches beside William's cradle, watching him sleep, blue eyes steady, full of care. Clara changed as well. Once a stranger bearing loss and debt, she had become the soul of the house. Every room bore her touch. Calico curtains, a table that always held flowers, quilts sewn through winter nights, In each small task, Clara made Elias's house a place that belonged to them both. One summer afternoon, Clara stood on the porch, wiping sweat after settling William inside. In the yard, Thomas and Margaret laughed, and Elias was latching the corral gate. He looked up when he finished, the sunset laying gold across his weathered face. He lifted a hand in greeting, a quick smile at his mouth. In that moment, Clara's heart fluttered as it had the day they met, only now with the weight of certainty. She thought, given every choice in the world, I would still choose you, Elias Turner, the man who turned a cold timber house into the place a heart belongs. When evening fell, the family gathered over a plain supper. Firelight from the hearth washed over each face. Children babbled, spoons clicked, and from Elias came the rare, full sound of his laughter. Clara looked around the table, gratitude filling her chest. Afterward, with the children asleep, Clara and Elias sat on the porch in the cool night wind. He set his hand over hers. No fine words were needed. The pressure of his grip told her enough. The road they had chosen from that uncertain start had become a solid home. The prairie stayed harsh. White winters, dusty summers. But to Clara, it no longer frightened. Inside this cabin, her heart had found its place. And Elias, steady and quiet, had turned an arranged match into true love, into family, into a life. In the hush of wind, Clara rested her head on Elias's shoulder and closed her eyes. She saw one thing clearly. Their journey did not end here. It had just begun. The journey of a family, of love, of a home that would always belong to the heart. 3 years had passed since the day Clara set foot in windswept Montana. Time had turned a lone timber cabin on the prairie into a home filled with laughter. The front yard no longer held only hoofbeats and the ring of a hammer, but the shouts of children at play. 3 little ones, bright-eyed and smiling, ran the porch, leaving tiny prints in the dust. The firstborn, Thomas, nearly 3, already gripped a small set of reins Elias had made for him. He toddled after his father to the stable, short legs pumping, eyes alight. The second, Margaret, named for cousin Marjorie, just past a year, with brown curls like Clara's, chirped at her mother's heels. The youngest, William, only a few months old, lay in the hand-built cradle, blue eyes tracking every motion in the room. The 2-story cabin, stout already, had been expanded. Elias raised a grain shed and another stall for the growing herd. Along the house, Clara planted a run of flowers beneath the porch. In spring and summer, wild blooms flared, yellow, purple, white, softening the rough timber with their gentle color. Each morning, when Clara opened the door, those colors and scents seemed to welcome the family into a new day. Clara often thought back to the beginning. She remembered her hands shaking around Marjorie's letter, the jolting coach, her first look at Elias, tall, quiet, hard to read. Then she had sought only a way to survive. 3 years had shown she'd found far more: a family, a love, a new life. Elias, the quiet man, was still himself, yet changed. He spoke little, but his every act showed he had grown used to warmth around him. He no longer ate fast in silence. He listened while Thomas told riding tales with a stick horse. He carried Margaret on one arm while fixing a fence with the other. He sat for long stretches beside William's cradle, watching him sleep, blue eyes steady, full of care. Clara changed as well. Once a stranger bearing loss and debt, she had become the soul of the house. Every room bore her touch: calico curtains, a table that always held flowers, quilts sewn through winter nights. In each small task, Clara made Elias's house a place that belonged to them both. Each day on the ranch was a chain of work without end. Morning sent Elias to the fields with Thomas toddling after, and Clara called the boy back when he strayed, afraid he'd fall. At noon, Clara set a meal as the smell of baking bread filled the rooms, Margaret at her feet playing with scraps of cloth. By afternoon, children's laughter traveled from the corrals to the porch, chasing away the prairie's dry heat. At night, the family drew to the fire, William asleep in the cradle, Elias and Clara seated close, listening to the wind at the eaves. One summer afternoon, Clara stood on the porch, wiping sweat after settling William inside. In the yard, Thomas and Margaret laughed, and Elias was latching the corral gate. He looked up when he finished, the sunset laying gold across his weathered face. He lifted a hand in greeting, a quick smile at his mouth. In that moment, Clara's heart fluttered as it had the day they met, only now with the weight of certainty. She thought, given every choice in the world, I would still choose you, Elias Turner, the man who turned a cold timber house into the place a heart belongs. There were nights, once the children slept, when Clara and Elias sat outside. The dark carried wild grass scent and a murmur of insects. They said little, and it was enough. Elias set his hand on Clara's, a grip simple and sure, like the man himself. She leaned against his shoulder, grateful for the road that had carried her from despair to peace. That winter, the snow fell deep, burying the roofline. Elias rose earlier to tend the stock. Clara kept the kitchen fire and made breakfast. When storms hit, they huddled by the hearth, Thomas and Margaret listening to tales of old trail drives, Clara rocking William to sleep. The wind's howl only sharpened the warmth inside. Clara knew the prairie would remain harsh, white winters, dust-blown summers, but none of it seemed fearful now. In this timber house, her heart had found its rest. And Elias, steady and unyielding, had turned an arranged marriage into true love, into family, into a life. In the soft hiss of wind, Clara rested her head on Elias's shoulder and closed her eyes. She saw one thing clearly. Their journey did not end here. It had just begun. The journey of a family, of love, of a home that would always belong to the heart. Perhaps the finest thing in this story is not the two-story cabin or the swelling herds, but the quiet way love took root. From two strangers, Clara and Elias chose trust and built a home where children's laughter replaced empty days. Montana's prairie would keep its dust and winter white, but in their hearts, the fire of family had never gone out. Proof that love needs no loud vows, only patience and honesty, and it will stand as firm as the ground beneath their feet. Friends, hearing this tale, you may remember a home, a look, or a hand that has held yours a lifetime. If it sparked a memory, share it below, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, so we can keep the flame of Wild West love stories burning.